when we left off, we were talking about evaluating the Ipcc, weren't we? We were talking about how useful they are, how great they are in terms of helping with climate change. Seems a bit pathetic now with all this virus stuff going on. It's like, does everyone talk about the climate? Not really. We were talking about how the Ipcc is very useful. It's all about lots of scientists. Remember, it produces all of those reports. Do you remember those? Yeah, I think you were you here on? But yeah, we were talking about the Ipcc reports, the various different ones, which are really useful to know. Okay, so if you can have any time, have a look at that. But basically, most of these, if not all of these, kind of reports kind of shape what happens after, or sort of happens before, in terms of what happens after in the various summits. Okay, the Ipcc reports essentially predate all of these summits, which is really, really useful to remember. Okay, so that can kind of give you a hint about what they're all about, but it's worth knowing about it. Okay. So essentially, if I remember last time on Thursday, we evaluated the Ipcc as really quite useful, but as with any international organisation, they have very little persuasive or coercive power. Okay, that's the point of it. So going on, basically, when we talk about these international summits, I'm going to slightly recap, but we'll go into it. Summits bring state actors together with scientists and NGOs and TNC. So not all of these are not just about various countries, they're also about representatives of other like corporations, organizations, etc., etc. For example, the UN is obviously at all of them, okay? And at the Stockholm Summit, kind of just going over these things a bit, it's the first summit on protecting the environment, okay? That's the first time. So historically, that's the precedent that's the Stockholm Agreement essentially sets. And the mission statement is identifying the problem requiring collective action, because we all essentially from the Stockholm Summit, we identified that in terms of human rights, they have a right to a clean environment. Okay, that is now a basic human right, along with freedom of practice, religion, and all that kind of stuff. Agreeing specific actions to be taken and making it happen. So we're talking about actual commitments to it rather than just paying lip service to the idea of climate change. Okay? So which summits apply to one or both of these mission statements, I suppose? So where do you think, like Kyoto, Rio, and Paris? Do they apply to both, if a few or all of them? You know, what do you think? Which summits apply to one or both of these mission statements? Right. Identifying a problem requiring an action, or agreeing specific actions to be taken and making it happen. So when do they?
Agreement would be agreeing specific actions.
Yes, so it's a commitment. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Kyoto would probably be something similar, wouldn't it? Yeah.
They implemented stuff. So.
Yep, exactly. They implemented, and Rio in. What do you think there, when it comes to Rio? When was the largest gathering of world leaders as of '92? I'm really glad they're all up here. But that's more to do with the right to clean environment. But as you see, again, we're thinking about the shift in agreements or summits from one of identifying it and then making it happen as the time progresses, okay? So that's how we remember them. So they share quite a similar approach, okay? So when we talk about the UN Conference on the Environment at Stockholm, there are 26 key principles not in international law, establishing the foundations of climate change research and state responsibilities with regards to safeguards and development. That's what the UN Conference in Stockholm basically did. In terms of something that's all-encompassing, I don't know how much more encompassing you can get, I suppose. Funny enough, something we haven't actually mentioned here, and that's probably the sixth one I was mentioning, is the Montreal Protocol, which goes in between Stockholm and Rio, because it's in 1989. It's all about protecting the ozone layer, banning CFCs and other non-carbon dioxide-based emissions. A precautionary principle scaled by country size. Do you know what's really, really interesting? From my point of view, the Montreal Protocol is one of the most successful ones ever, in so much as we hardly ever use CFCs anymore. In terms of non-carbon dioxide polluters, we hardly ever use that anymore. Apart from methane, but that comes from animals. You can't get rid of that. That has actually been one of the most successful things we've done. The ozone layer isn't exactly better, but it's much less damaged, which is really, really interesting to think about. It's one of the forgotten protocols. You see? Yeah, absolutely. But I suppose it's because there are much easier and I suppose cheaper solutions, which is carbon dioxide. But for example, that's why you don't see as many spray cans. Or if the spray cans, if you do have spray cans, they involve I can't remember what element it is, but it's not. But I think it is more carbon dioxide now. Okay, but in terms of non-carbon dioxide-based emissions, we've actually done really well. We banned it. You have the Rio Earth Summit, which is the framework for future action, okay, agreeing to our good old friend, the UNFCCC, the great framework that makes all of the rest, everything else come to pass. Linking economic progress with the environment. A healthy environment is a human right, which, as we mentioned, with establishing the idea of it, sustainable development and improving scientific knowledge, okay? So, again, looking at establishing principles and establishing rights in terms of the climate, essentially. And so, it's sort of putting a moral spin on climate change as a point, okay? That's the main thing. You were right there, Abraham.
Yeah.
A bit confused.
Sorry, my mind's in meditation.
It's alright. I don't blame you in many ways. Does that make sense? So what we've got is, and that's why I put on your sheets, and for those watching online, you guys have seen that. That's why we're talking about the 6. So we're talking about these, but we're also mentioning the Montreal Protocol. Okay. Does that make sense? So what you've got is this essentially is summing up a lot of your really, really good work, which I wish we could replicate, but virus permitting, we'll see how much we can do. So sorry for coming in your way. Okay, so it's lots of different elements, but a lot of it is building up towards what we now know to be the more coercive elements. Although the Montreal Protocol is, as I keep mentioning, a bit of an anomaly in that it was like, no, we're going to actually ban this, because I suppose in many ways, and I completely agree, the ozone layer is one of the most important aspects because it sort of protects us from the very, very harmful rays. And what carbon dioxide does is it just creates it creates a layer, which is where the whole idea of greenhouse gases, whereas CFCs were literally penetrating the thing and letting in UV rays, which was just damaging us, I suppose. So in some way, the Montreal Protocol came as a necessity to ban things, whereas with carbon dioxide, it's a bit more difficult because we use that in order to make stuff in industries. So that's why it's a bit of an anomaly, the protocol. Smaller, but it bans stuff. So you can say that, I suppose, as an example of an international agreement, it's not impossible to get things done. The only problem is everything's relative. Okay? Does that make sense? It's there's just those 3, and then of course we have the other 3. But I'll happily wait for you guys to finish off. I suppose understanding these conferences really. Yeah, carbon dioxide-based emissions. Big step. Maybe it's because it was in Montreal, I don't know. But essentially it's heating up the planet still if you're letting in much more ultraviolet rays. Oh my goodness. 25 minutes.
Coronavirus taking a PE.
Well, PE might for 25 minutes. Okay. Have you managed to get enough to get around, Abraham?
Emissions, big stuff.
Oh, big, you're there.
Did you wash your hands when I came in?
So I was just saying that we're recording the lesson.
What?
Why? because everything's going online.
Oh shit.
Anyway, so we're just saying that everything's going to be on YouTube live, but I'll make more. I'll essentially outline more of it on Teams.
This is ridiculous.
You can get over it. It's fine. Yeah. Okay. So the other three summits, as we know, Kyoto Summit and Protocol was legally binding targets to reduce emissions, establishing carbon credits, time limited to 2012. Okay, that's the very important things to remember when it comes to Kyoto. So we have legally binding targets, as those I've mentioned, and yeah, carbon credits. It's an idea of trading, I suppose, trading carbon emissions, or trying to limit things by looking at a more global approach, I suppose. You have Copenhagen, which, well done, Zaya, for doing. Limiting global temperature increase to 2 degrees. National transparency on the whole idea of climate change, so not keeping things from us. The Green Climate Fund, so we're talking about lots of countries essentially giving money to this massive pot, and that's going to be helping to develop clean industries in places which they can't afford to make it. And national plans for essentially how to tackle climate change are going to be published, so everyone knows where we stand. So that's what Copenhagen is. 2015 Paris Summit is the balance of emissions. Okay, so now we're talking about really harsh measures. I say harsh, it should be done. Reviewing progress every 5 years with a 3-year exit time, so it's much harder to get out of it, which the US is finding to its annoyance, I suppose. And it continues to oppose 2020 plans to cut emissions, okay? So we're talking about a much more long-term approach there, okay? So that's essentially like just a very, very, very short summary of the summits. So what I want you to do, I suppose we have to be in your own time rather than now, because, I mean, we could do it now, but yeah, why don't we do it now? Why don't we do it now? Rank the summits based on effectiveness, powers, coercion, results, attendance, practicality, and plans for the future. There's no right or wrong answer for this. It's what you believe to be the most successful, okay? For all those watching online, it's on the next slide. So you can do that, print it off, or actually you can write inside it and then print it off or something like that. Rank the summits, okay? So what you believe to be effectiveness, power, coercion, results, okay? I'll give you a good 10 or so minutes to do this, 10, 15 minutes.
Are you writing?
Yeah. What you believe to be the most important, okay? So you have ranked, so from 1 to 6, so the number 1 is the most important, and then you go down. Rank it in terms of effectiveness and all that kind of stuff, because then it'll give you a really good idea of the summits, okay? Any questions? No? Okay. So yeah, all the summits I've just mentioned, okay?
They have to be every single one.
So
like Kyoto, say, New York, and then Copenhagen.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. So all columns are different, okay? That's the idea. All right, so I'll give you about 15 minutes to do that. I'll just let this run, I think.
Could you go back to the...
Yeah, of course. This one? Because there's the... Oh, sorry.
3 for each of the summits.
Yeah, 3. So you've got the UN, that's Stockholm, basically. That's the Montreal Protocol, which I hadn't mentioned beforehand.
Okay.
But that's about banning CFCs. The 92 Rio Earth Summit,
Cool.
Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris. So basically it's all of them plus Montreal
Okay.
in 1989. So just do it by like Rio, Montreal, Kyoto. Don't do the whole like summits and all that stuff.
Okay.
Copenhagen, Paris. I'll give you about 15 minutes for that.
Wait, thinking about powers.
By sorry?
Powers.
As in, like, did they have the powers to like do anything? Okay, so it's like coercion, like what? Not coercion, but it's like their
Like if it was really binding.
yeah, their ability to do anything. I suppose.
The UN conference 1972, that's the Stockholm.
Stockholm, yeah. A lovely flag.
Which one saw the biggest decrease of emissions?
Which one saw the biggest decrease in emissions?
That would be effectiveness. Like
Yeah.
at the top.
In a way, probably Paris. I mean, like all of them have probably not done very well.
Yeah.
I thought the best one was Montreal.
Montreal, yeah, but that's for non-carbon dioxide. But even, actually, but you make a good point. You make a good point. If anything, that's probably going to be the most effective because if you think about it, Paris has been quite good, but it's not been as like amazing, I suppose. But on a very specific point. Sorry.
Montreal might be more practical.
Yeah, yeah.
They laid it out.
And they said they're just playing banning CFCs. Yeah, I suppose in that way. But I think on a more grand scale, maybe Paris. Maybe, I think.
Because there more attendance as well. Because then
We got that as well.
Was Paris the most attended one? Like,
Yes.
so that. Was the US and China at the Paris one?
Mm-hmm. There's no right or wrong answer, but it's good to know this so that you can distinguish between the summits. I suppose it's good having all those up there, but now you're trying to think like what's been the best. Hopefully, you'll find that one of them does come up to be better than the others. And once you do, that's basically called evaluation. This is like the most base version of evaluation I can get.
You know, they might postpone the exams till 2021.
Doubt it.
They said that's the most like.
That's the worst version.
Yeah, I know it's the worst, but that's what they're saying is the best one. Just because it's the delay phase. But what is that going to mean for university?
That's the point. That's why I can't see it happening.
Not so dumb.
No,
I feel like they might.
They could do the exams, it's just not easy.
But the thing is, it's sort of, how the invigilators have it, they can't separate every single person with it.
No, but it's possible to do it. It's possible to do it if like you just have fewer people in rooms, and you have like one invigilator per like 3 or 4 people.
Yeah, but like, how are they gonna have the supplies to do that? Like in this college, everyone names.
Look, so many people are being made redundant these days. People will be happy for the trade.
People being made redundant.
All over the place, yeah. Anyway, go on, finish.
No,
If you can't work from home, you can stay.
yeah, my friend's mom can't work anymore. Like they're not allowing her to go to work.
It's gonna be a really difficult situation.
I think we might just all get our predicted grades, to be honest.
Maybe they just all give us A personally.
A star.
No, you need someone to die in this do an exam to get that. Is I'm gonna do it? I'm gonna take the plunge. Anyway, come on, finish these off so you understand about the summits, and then we'll move on to the national ones about climate change. And then if we've got time, we'll nail human rights. Because once we've done human rights, we get on to the most fun bit. Power.
Huh?
Power. Global power. We have 5 minutes or so to do this. Maybe 10 if you want. If you're struggling.
So all of these summits and they become bigger and bigger every year, every time.
Essentially, yes.
They
Yeah.
become more and more important.
Well, essentially, it kind of has to be because 1 year more countries around. You know, more countries being made every year and stuff. So that's that generally, but also you're inviting more TNCs, I suppose, as well. Getting more and more powerful. Amazon's going to make a killing at this point.
You they run out of eggs.
Yep.
Eggs and
I'm going to miss my McMuffins.
all these stupid people are making everyone else have to act like that as well. Because if all these people take everything, we're gonna have everyone else is gonna have to take
You have
everything.
no idea how selfish people have been for the last week or 2 weeks. You know, stockpiling could not be more selfish.
Absolutely ruined my week.
It's the most selfish thing that ever could happen.
Every time I see someone with more than 2 bags, I get slightly upset.
Me too.
It's just annoying. I'm in Costco and I was walking out. It's just people with.
If anything, they're making the problem worse.
Yeah. There's gonna be more fucking deaths of starvation of this shit than actual coronavirus. It's great.
I saw someone walking down the street with like 3 packets of tissue roll.
The thing is, you've got to do it now in so many ways.
That's the thing, like these people actually doing it. Like now everyone has to do it, otherwise they're not even gonna have anything.
No, I haven't yet.
Yeah, but the reason is it's not because of coronavirus, it's because of
People.
people.
I think my friend's workplace, people were lining up, like it was a Sainsbury's, people were lining outside the Sainsbury's so they could, like before it opened, so they could get all of the stuff.
Could dash
straight
in.
away.
Yeah, that's what everyone's doing now. They're trying to get the over.
Yeah. If anyone's going, there's, what's the human race like? That's what happens. When things get bad, we all revert to mean.
It's so much for democracy.
Give you a few more minutes to do this, guys.
I don't have anything for coercion on results. I think that's
Like Copenhagen.
Results. I put Montreal up in the top in many ways.
Why?
Montreal, I could say Kyoto, because the results, they actually go.
Oh, shoot, yeah. I mean, it depends what you define as results. If you consider a massive result to be everyone agreeing that good climate is a human right, that's a pretty big result, isn't it? Theoretically.
It doesn't really do much.
Wait, would
People-
No, but it means that you set up the argument.
You established that.
Stockholm.
Oh,
It's a pretty big deal if you think about it. If it wasn't for Stockholm, many of these wouldn't have
I put that as
existed.
coercion, because that's what brought it.
Well, if you consider making climate a human right, it's completely coercion because it's putting the moral judgment, the moral viewpoint, the moral standpoint for sorting out the climate. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of like, if you consider morality and coercion, yeah. I considered Kyoto in terms of coercion to be up there as well. Paris, absolutely, in terms of you're not allowed to leave it for 3 years once you say you want to.
It's legally binding Kyoto, so it makes it that you have to.
Yeah. That's why I put that up there, for sure. I mean, in terms of Montreal as well, I mean, they just straight up banned CFCs. I mean, that's, banning that's coercion. Like, you're not allowed to use them at all.
What CFCs?
CFCs. I can't remember exactly what CFC, but it's basically non-carbon dioxide emitters. What is it? Exactly what CFCs there as well. The climate's fudged. Cool. We finished. But
No, but I think it's lower than
what do you think is the least then? What do you think is being one of the most useless? I mean, we haven't really mentioned Copenhagen, but I mean they've been quite useful in so much as they decided to use the UNFCCC.
I feel like they're quite
Useful.
idealistic.
Yeah,
Because
Copenhagen is. I mean, if anything, Stockholm is. Well, if even more so, I think Paris is. Not limiting it to more than 2 degrees. I mean, like if you think about it, how much power do we have over the climate?
that's what I'm saying, because it's like, there's, like, it's just like fake, like, goal they're working to. So like, Copenhagen and Paris are more realistic.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, it's your judgment at the end of the day. You struggling.
Chlorofluorocarbon. I know we both, the one I see more important is it's gonna be Paris and Montreal. The other one, you see the difference between the other.
It's almost like setting precedents. That's kind of what a lot of them do. Okay. A lot of them set precedents. For example, we're talking about carbon credits. We're talking about country-specific reduction of pollution in Kyoto, and we're talking about actual limiting emissions wholesale. Okay, so there are lots of differences.
Yeah, so it's chlorofluorocarbon.
That's the one. That's why I can't remember it.
Yeah. So the molecules, the ultraviolet light rays strike them,
Mm-hmm.
creating carbon chlorine bond, makes it break, producing a chlorine atom, which then reacts with the ozone molecule, which destroys it. So a single CFC molecule can destroy 100,000 ozone molecules.
That's pretty bad.
And there's like millions and billions of CFC molecules.
Okay, in terms of the most important ones, hopefully you've evaluated it. What's the most important summit we've ever had? Paris?
Kyoto.
Kyoto.
Kyoto, Paris.
Kyoto, Paris.
Paris.
Paris? What do you think is the most important one we've had?
Montreal.
Okay. I would agree.
In terms of effectiveness, not.
Well, it's in general, not just effectiveness, like everything.
Oh, in general, oh, with
Yeah.
Paris, then.
Paris. I'd agree. It means that it's the last one we've done. It's the most far-reaching. It's the most idealistic in many ways. I suppose one of the things to say about Paris is that if it weren't for all of these, I suppose Paris couldn't have existed. But I suppose in that way, you're looking more at the summit than the context. So don't just think about it in isolation. Think about what it is within the scope of loads of other summits. That's the point, I think, to think about. So, have we got time to do this? Okay. Yeah, do you know what? Let's do it. So, in terms of 2019, okay, 2019 Madrid, this is the latest summit that we've had, okay? So, we're not mentioning it because we're not going to be expected to know, because it's been too early. We haven't really been able to assess it. It's not in your textbook, but it's good to know in terms of context. Have a look at Madrid 2019, COP25 as they call it. What has been agreed for 2025? What does the summit mostly focus on? How is it building or rebuilding on Paris 2015? And was it a success or a failure? Okay, so as we watch this video, Philip, right there. If we watch this video, try and see if we can answer these questions in terms of how it all fits in when we go from Copenhagen all the way to Paris, okay? Where does this fit in terms of where we've got to beforehand and where we are now, okay? Hopefully this should work. And I advise you, if you're watching online, to play the video as well.
All smiles in Madrid for COP25, but each year the warnings become more and more grave.
By the end of the coming decade, we will be on one of two paths. One is the path of surrender, where we have sleepwalked past the point of no return, jeopardizing the health and safety of everyone on this planet.
Since COP began in 1995, global man-made carbon dioxide production has risen 55%, dipping only during the financial crisis a decade ago. Donald Trump is pulling the US out of the 2015 Paris Accord. The world's second biggest emitter will abandon the landmark climate goal next year unless Nancy Pelosi's Democrats can defeat Trump.
By coming here, we want to say to everyone, we're still in. The United States is still in.
This summit is mostly about nailing down the final details from 2015.
If we don't get the rules right, we could end up in a scenario where ultimately it doesn't help us stay under our carbon budget globally.
Central to that is Article 6, a global carbon market where rich countries often pay for green initiatives in the developing world. But some countries like Brazil are said to be pushing for creative double counting.
If you're counting one emission reduction in two places, then it would appear on paper that we're making progress towards reducing emissions globally, and in reality we're not.
Many delegates in Madrid may look to Canada to learn lessons from Ottawa's rocky rollout of carbon pricing.
In terms of communications, in terms of revenue use, in terms of technical details to make sure that we are really incentivizing heavy emitters to reduce pollution.
COP25 will also be a starting point in the lead up to next year. At COP26, the Paris targets, which are already being missed, are up for renewal. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
So has it been good or has it not been good? What will we say about Madrid?
Well, they're just acknowledging the fact that even their latest Paris agreement, the targets
They've been missed. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So again, it falls into the narrative of it's not been for example, saying Paris isn't that been that useful, hasn't been good. what are the things that the conference is looking at mostly, or was looking at mostly? Remember? Well, it's essentially saying all the stuff that they've missed out in Paris, but they're talking about the green market. Yeah, we're talking about rich states paying into the. We talked about a green climate fund, but now we're talking about it as a market itself. Okay, so we're talking about, you know, financial incentives for creating green industry and green technology in developing markets. Okay, so we're talking about introducing climate change essential elements into capitalism, into the global market. Okay, so it's using globalism and climate change together. Okay, that's the idea. It's using those two elements to help each other. Okay, that's the idea of it. It's all like saying, rather than fighting one against each other, why don't we like try and work them together? That's the idea. Okay, you right there? What do you think that Madrid 2019 was a success or failure?
I don't think you can evaluate it. So.
Yeah, you can't really evaluate it, but I mean, nothing essentially has been. It's not as big as Paris, obviously.
No.
But what it is it's sort of, again, it's starting the debate. Of course, Greta was there, and that's where she had a lovely sort of rant, but and one of her many ones. But you know, that's it. Again, it's starting the conversation again. Okay, but it's a failure in terms of nothing much has happened, but in terms of context, it's really interesting to see where it fits in. So, last thing we're going to talk about is non-state and state actors in climate change. Okay, so we're talking about a more of a micro approach rather than a macro. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about. The last thing we're going to look at when it comes to climate change. So, when it comes to non-state actors in climate change, okay, climate change approaches are on a more local level, which we're going to talk about. So maybe we're talking about more practical ideas. We're talking about on the ground. We're talking about what can individual companies do to like change and make things better. Guys, you're on your phones rather than looking here. Okay. So we're looking at cities, for example. You know, it's a non-state actor. So basically, non-state actor is just anyone who's not the state. Okay. We have, for example, we have the congestion charge zone, and the do you know what ULEZ means?
Yes.
What does it mean?
Sign, zone.
You're on the ball.
Use less emission zone.
We don't need to know.
Ultra low emission zone.
That's the one. Ultra low emission zone in London.
Yeah, that requires you have it on there, like users.
Yeah, some do.
So not diesel basically.
Not diesel. Yeah.
Diesel shit.
Okay. Then that's why you get electric. And for example, city gardens are being made in Singapore, which is quite interesting.
Oh yeah,
What does that mean?
They're very
Yeah, but they're basically, rather than, you know, like you have massive city, like building blocks. Now they're for example, you know, if you think about like a city square, like a block of like where you put flats, they just put a garden in instead. It's really amazing. There's loads of them as well. It's a good idea because Singapore was an awful city in terms of like just breathing. And we also have the MNC, which is free market competition for greener alternatives. Okay, so this is what we're talking about with Madrid 2019 a lot, with like Tesla and inner corporation incentives to clean up industry. Okay, so now we're trying to incentivize companies to introduce greener elements into their business. This is why the electric car industry has taken off. Do you know how many like grants they've been given essentially? But this is why when people were buying a lot of electric cars and still are, up until I think it was last year, November, is that the government gave you some money to help pay for a electric car. So it makes electric cars really quite, a lot cheaper.
Well, electric cars aren't cheap.
Well, a lot cheaper than they could be. For example, you've got a £4,000 grant from the government to buy an electric car. If you wanted to buy an electric car. Essentially, when you look at the price of electric cars, they're £4,000 cheaper. They were. I think they got rid of them now. But that's what we're talking about, incentives. Okay? So not only for the manufacturer, but also for the consumer. Okay? Obviously, I don't think we can do this now, but I'd like you to, in your own time, find examples of cities and companies tackling climate change on their own. So, for example, London and Copenhagen are doing really well, quite a lot. But I want you to have a look at, when you can, in your own time, about what's Amazon and what's Unilever doing? Okay, because that's really, really interesting to see. And wondering, is it working? Well, if you look in London, for example, actually in terms of emissions, we've done very, very well. We are producing less emissions now than we were 10 years ago. The only problem is that kind of gets skewed because London is growing, therefore we're actually including more people and more businesses into the percentage. So it's actually quite difficult to see like how much we've actually gone down by. But if you look at the city of London, for example, that's gone heavily down. Ever since they introduced the ULEZ, okay, no lorries are going in there, hardly any. It's a big deal. It's done really well. You know, but in Copenhagen, you have loads of bike lanes. You know, in Amsterdam they've got the same thing, but that's what they're doing there. But Copenhagen's doing even more so, actually. But the thing is, with Copenhagen, it's much less densely populated, so it's a bit easier for them to do that.
Could you say the building of cycle lanes into London that they've got the super highways? I think that would be an example of London working.
Yeah, for sure. You know, anything which essentially takes people out of sort of public transport, but out of cars. Okay. Yes, absolutely. You can use. They can also say that people are using now electric scooters. And now they're going to try and make them legal on pavements again, because again, it's another idea of saying actually it's a green alternative to anything else. So that's really interesting. I mean, Amazon and Unilever, I think there's two different elements, but Amazon are doing actually a lot more green incentive stuff. For example, they are. I mean, I think it's more to do with technology from the point of view of companies. For example, drones. One of the reasons why I'm manufacturing drones isn't so much because then they can deliver things to you better, is because they don't have to put everything in a car. They can just send it onto a drone and then it just sort of drops everything off at you. I mean, this is like really high-tech stuff, which they're not doing for a while, but it's something that they are doing. So is it working? It's up to you whether you think it is. Okay? Their own incentives. So this is not something that governments is telling them to do, it's what they're trying to do. And that's why it makes it even more interesting, is that it's more of a self-made initiative, rather than something like, if you don't do this, we're all going to die. You see what I mean? Like, we're not going to die. Nothing.
Technology is the way forward.
Yeah. Oh my God, absolutely. There's a friend of mine, not a friend of mine. There's a friend of a friend of mine who's. That's why it's spurious. A friend of mine who's working on a type of paint, right, in South America, in Argentina, that is full of these nanites or something like that. And this paint works like a solar panel. So if you painted on something and then configure it to like a battery, it can actually charge itself rather than having massive solar panels. So imagine this: you put the paint all over a building, and then the building essentially charges itself rather than having loads of solar panels on the top. Wouldn't that be insane? You do the same thing with a car. Imagine that: you paint a car. With the stuff, you're basically driving a massive solar panel.
Or you don't have to recharge.
Exactly. Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, but then no one's going to do that.
Well, they
will charge like £1,000 for.
Well, if you can mass manufacture it, which Tesla already tried to ask him for the rights. They've already tried to buy him out. He said no, because he knows this is going to be massive.
He's going to get billions.
It's going to get absolute killing.
Yeah,
but it's
that friend of a friend to a friend.
I know. That's what I need to do. But unfortunately, he lives in Argentina. A bit of a distance, and we're not going to be able to be travelling for a while. So I haven't got much of a choice at this point in time. But again, it's all of these technological incentives which are going to make more of a difference, I suppose, on the ground. But it's up to you whether you consider this, all the international summits, or these things which are actually maybe making more of a difference. That might be more interesting, right? That's big. Okay.
Yeah, I'm looking at something.
So, when it comes to national governments in climate change, okay, meaningful climate change approaches are more likely at the national level, okay? Absolutely, it's more likely at the national level. Okay, we're now looking at national governments. All of these summits are always going to have to involve the initiatives of national governments. National regulations have more weight than international influence or independent industry initiatives. At the end of the day, it's the nation state that is going to change or make climate change better, or make climate better. So, obviously, I'm not going to do this because I just don't think we just have the time at the moment. Or could we do it? Nah, don't worry about it. So these examples, okay, for example, we have the 1956 UK Clean Air Act, which is the first national initiative in the world aimed solely at cleaning the environment, okay? So it's the first act of Parliament. If anything, the Clean Air Act changes the constitution of the UK Parliament. If you remember, we looked at, you probably in first year, you probably looked at changing the constitution and all that, and how it works in the UK. The Clean Air Act is the first time that any nation has put changing the climate as part of its constitution. It's pretty big. That's why it's a really good initiative to think about. In 2008, you have in the UK again, you have the Department of Energy and Climate Change, or Climate Change Act, okay, which ratifies the Kyoto Protocol. But you have the first creation of the Department of Energy and Climate Change. So now we have a ministry in the UK. So again, these are initiatives that have really helped. And these two bits, these two elements, the Clean Air Act and the Climate Change Act, are some of the reasons why Britain, remember, is the 5th largest economy in the world, okay? And we emit 1.5%, of global CO2 emissions.
Is that good or bad?
That's amazing. We've done so well. We're the 5th largest economy, and we emit 1.5%. The US, I can't remember how much, something like 15 or 20? It's the second biggest emitter though.
The US can't really change their constitution like we can.
No.
They can't go on.
Exactly, so that's one of the good things about having an uncodified constitution, but that's a good thing to link to paper 2, sorry.
Well, we found one.
Hmm?
We found a good thing about it.
Here we go, we've done it. Oh, what, did you guys all say that we all should have a codified constitution?
Nah, it's just
They just found it.
Oh, sorry, I see. We found a link. Well, yeah, Britain has done really well in the field of climate change, if you think about it, in terms of fixing or giving us a right for fixing the climate, and we've done it. In 2003, Brazil had the Native Vegetarian Protection Act, protecting the Amazon, which of course didn't really work. It did for a while, and then we burnt it.
how did it start? Was it just...
Oh, I don't know how it's. I'm sure it was because they were because we've been deforesting Brazil. So we could have done it. I'm pretty sure we might have, but it's hard to tell. It could have been climate change. It could have been.
The monkeys know how to use fire.
Hey, it could have been the koalas. They did it in Australia. Big point. Big point.
Which means the quality will die,
Maybe that's what they wanted you to think.
How many are left now? I swear they
I feel like there's been wiping out 4 million creatures.
Shit.
But anyway, in terms of national incentives, okay, we have the EU carbon tax. The EU carbon tax, basically, all companies have to pay tax on how much carbon they emit. So in terms of initiatives, that's a big deal, okay? And so it's another sort of incentive, I suppose. And you have the UK electric car grant, which is what I mentioned to you, which is that, you get paid, you get, the government essentially pays for a bit of your car when you buy an electric car. So it's a big deal there, really big. So you have a lot of things, a lot of examples of different parts, of different types of national incentives, which in my view make the biggest impact. These are quite good. Non-state actors are really useful. But when it comes to what happens on the ground, it's national governments. Okay, so now you can hopefully you'll be able to see the difference between the different kinds of incentives. Okay, there's on a more local level, micro level, the national level, and the international level, and it's up to you how you consider what you consider to be the most in terms of impact. So, lastly, the points to remember on climate change before we leave climate change for good, I suppose, is the UNFCCC. What does that mean?
United Nations Federation Commitment to Climate Change.
What?
It's on the board.
It's there.
Oh shit. I was guessing. I was close though.
Thank you for playing.
I missed the one word.
Yes, framework for convention, if I missed two. Okay, It paves the way for the international summits through the UN. Okay, that's what that does. International efforts still require state leadership and acceptance, i.e., realism has to go hand in hand with liberalism. Okay, nation states are still most important, and they have to do things for the international good. It's one of the only times where realism and liberalism kind of go hand in hand. Okay. Developed and developing nation states have different outlooks on climate change. Why?
Wait, what?
Developed and developing nations have different outlooks on climate change. Why?
Because developed nations need the things that cause climate change, whereas developing states don't need it so much.
Yes.
You don't do that at all.
In terms of manufacturing, it's all about how much of a presence you have on the global market in terms of buying and selling things. How much do you have to export? How much do you have to make and then export it, and then how much you have to import? And that's all got to do with CO2 emissions. Okay, and developing states have less to do with that. Of course, it's much more. They have much more of a say or a thought to it now because, of course, with globalism, lots and lots of companies have come in and they've enriched the country or stolen resources, however you like to call it. But now they have a stake in globalism, and therefore they have a stake in CO2 emissions. So it's like there's been a slight sort of shifting to the middle, but less so, I think. Coercion of states does not work. These did not help coerce nations as much. US, when it comes to Paris, okay, for example, US and China when it came to Kyoto. So it's really not been good at coercing states because it creates an unfair, pardon the pun, atmosphere. Okay. As time has gone by, there have been more successes in agreeing ways forward, but only really in agreeing ways forward, rather than saying, right, we're all going to do this, yeah? And everyone goes, maybe. Or is it, this is what we're going to think about tomorrow, and everyone goes, yeah, absolutely, we're going to do that tomorrow. You see what I mean? Well, why is this happening? It's trial and error or reaction to things getting worse. What do you think?